I think at one point in the book, you compare this sort of raggle-taggle army, or the challenge of moving it from place to place, and you say the only sort of modern equivalent that could be sort of conceived of is UNHCR's responsibility for refugees. Only the refugees in this case are going into danger rather than being taken out of it. And I thought that was a very telling way of sort of bringing that alive for modern readers.
It is something which is pretty much unique in the Middle Ages to crusading, because they were always regarded as being pilgrimages, and that's even true of the more streamlined and the more military expeditions that we set out in the 1200s. So there was always the feeling that it would have been better for the military cause if primarily combatants went. You couldn't exclude non-combatants, and there are even instances in the campaigning in the Nile Delta of non-combatants joining expeditions as they made their way into the interior, almost as if the leaders felt that they couldn't exclude them. They had to be allowed to go along. Now, if you're going to have non-combatants along, then obviously you have to find security for them during campaigns, in particular during battles. And there were one or two instances during the great campaign, the great army led by Barbarossa in 1190, when he actually says, I cannot provide security for the non-combatants. We do not have enough troops. We're going to have to leave them to look after themselves. We're focused on defeating the Muslims, and we hope that the non-combatants will be okay. They are a constant issue, which gradually, as time goes by, thoughtful clerics begin to address. They say, well, these people should stay at home, and they should pay money instead for other people to go to subsidise the expeditions of others. But there is always the feeling this is a pilgrimage, and the great thing about a pilgrimage is people cannot be told they shouldn't take part. So the inclusivity of crusading was always in a tension with its military effectiveness. It was bound to be there because of the nature of the whole enterprise.
By 1099, the First Crusade had achieved its principal objective of recovering Jerusalem for the Christians. Subsequent crusades had much more mixed fortune. So is the trajectory, should we see it as a sort of downward fall after the First Crusade of military disasters or only mixed successes for the Crusade's mission?
In purely military terms, that's probably not inaccurate. This was a big problem that crusading commentators had to face. The only crusade which was totally successful was the First Crusade, which managed to conquer Jerusalem and to create a kind of perimeter around it. That was in itself an issue, because the First Crusade was not actually a model for later ones to follow, because it had been a fairly sort of nondescript and certainly uncontrolled exercise. So looking back to the First Crusade actually became a hindrance. But I see the pattern not as being a sort of single trajectory, but rather more as being a sort of up and down pattern. I mean, there were later successes, there were partial successes. Even the Fourth Crusade, which very contentiously ended up taking Byzantine Constantinople instead of going to assist the Holy Land, was regarded by some people as being a success, because it established another Christian outpost in the east, and that's a very tendentious reading. But it does reinforce the point that it's not simply a trajectory downwards. There are successes later, there are failures later, but the overall feeling is of the Holy Land slipping away. And that's certainly the case in the 1200s, that mobilising what is needed to try to hold on to and to recover the holy places is posing more and more of a difficulty, and there is more and more suspicion about the motives of those who are engaged in organising and controlling the great crusading enterprises.
We haven't said anything yet about the people the Crusaders were fighting against, and in your book, in the colour plate section, there's a very telling juxtaposition of two images of Saladin, the Muslim leader. One
of them depicts a duel, which actually never happened, but people like to imagine it happening, between the great Christian commander Richard the Lionheart, Richard Coeur de Lion, and Saladin, the two great leaders of the opposing forces in the Third Crusade. And in that picture, Saladin is shown as pretty much as a ruffian who's being dismounted, as not a savoury character at all. He's effectively being demonised. In the other picture of the great Muslim leader. He is shown as a figure of gallantry, a figure of gravitas, a military leader who has achieved great things. And the fact is that both of the images ran through the Christian view of Saladin in the late 12th and 13th centuries. But it has to be said that no other Muslim leader, and there were others who arguably were more successful than Saladin was, no other Muslim leader made the same kind of impact on the Western European thinking that Saladin did. His name became very well known. There was a whole cluster of legends which accrued around the image of Saladin, including his being converted to Christianity, which of course would have been the ultimate sort of benefit if this great leader had actually come over to our side. All one can really say is that there is a diversity, there's a whole spectrum of response to Saladin. He's too great to be ignored, but on the other hand, he is the leader of this demonic force, so he certainly cannot be sort of seen in entirely kind of welcoming terms.
Women made up part of the crusading force, but they were non-combatants. Yeah. So can you say a bit about the extent to which they participated in crusades and what kind of role they had?
Well, they weren't taking part as combatants, except on one or two rather badly evidenced examples, which may come from Muslim side anyway. But they did have a definite role to play. Noble women, for example, who took the cross were particularly welcome because they would bring contingents with them, and though they wouldn't lead them, they would be responsible for provisioning and equipping them and paying them, so that their contribution was decidedly sort of appreciated by the church. Women who weren't of noble birth could come as companions to their husbands, and that was not frowned on. That was seen as being perfectly acceptable. Or they could come along as non-combatants and carry out other roles within the army, the roles of medieval women generally, cooking, washing, etc. They had a role to play, and as I said before, because it was a pilgrimage, they certainly couldn't be excluded.
There are some very interesting pages in the book about the difficulty of keeping the Crusaders disciplined and focused. I think you say gambling, swearing and illicit sex were the three sort of major challenges to discipline that those leading the crusade had to try and enforce.
These are armies of penitents, so the importance of stopping them from committing further sin is appreciated. But more than that, there is the feeling that this is the army of God. It's engaged on a military enterprise which is of specific value and importance, and so sinfulness cuts against that military objective and is likely to turn God against the Crusaders, and therefore to bring military defeats about. This theme of anything that goes wrong on a crusade not being down to Muslim superiority or Muslim leadership, but being down to Christian sinfulness is there from the start, and it leads to a kind of a violent oscillation in the way in which Crusaders regard their task. That they, on the one hand, they believe it to be mandated and supported by God, so triumphs are greeted as with jubilation as proof that God is supporting the enterprise. But on the other hand, when things go wrong, then they realise that they must have brought it about. So you have violent penitence, which takes the form of particularly strict decrees against gambling, and in some cases on the First Crusade, of all women being taken away from the main Crusader camp and being placed in alternative camps just for women in order to reduce the opportunity for sexual behaviour taking place.